I never enjoyed camping. I savored the comfortability that modern life affords. But every year, my old group of high school friends would go up to the same lake and set up tents on the same shorefront and drink the same beers and tell the same stories. I went along with it. It was kind of like having a bad job. But all your coworkers were awesome, making the whole thing bearable. So, for 2 to 3 days a year, I put up with sleeping in the woods, purely for the laughs that came with it. We'd all drive up on Friday right after work and usually stay until Monday. We'd park, hike 2 kilometers along the edge of the water to our usual campsite, and set up for the long weekend. The last time we went camping, I was running late. I had a major project at work that kept getting sent back by my boss to be tweaked. I couldn't leave the city with my girlfriend, Kat. Until after 9 p.m., a storm was right at our backs, the entire drive up to the country, and it seemed to be headed directly toward the lake. Then, we hit heavy traffic. An 18-wheeler had jackknifed, blocking the road. The pre-storm rain caught up to us. Fast. Kat and I didn't reach the turnoff for the camp parking lot until after midnight. I immediately recognized all 4 of my friends' cars parked near the waterfront. That's when a flurry of delayed texts finally hit my phone from my buddy Jeremy. Reception was terrible out there, so you could never really count on messages getting through. The texts had been sent hours apart. Jeremy told me they had switched campsites this year. He said they'd finally made it to Whispering, the island. The island was always spoken of as being completely forbidden, mostly because it was near impossible to reach. It was diamond-shaped, but much longer than it was wide. Surrounded by razor-sharp rocks and dense, suffocating trees, a heavy current smashed into it head-on, splitting the rushing water to both sides. The only side that wasn't overcome with deadly rapids was the backside, which featured a high, rocky cliff jutting 30 feet above the water. The cliff had a massive, flat surface that overlooked the entire lake. It was the absolute perfect campsite. If only it was accessible. Because of the treacherous rapids and rocks, it remained completely untouched. It was the one place everyone wanted to camp, but no one could reach. Kayakers and boaters actively avoided the area. It was beautiful to look at, but potentially fatal to attempt. Except that year, there had been a severe drought in the county. It hadn't rained in weeks, so the water level had plummeted, exposing the rocky bed beneath the rapids. For the first time ever, you could walk straight across to the island. Jeremy said the group made a snap decision. They trekked across the dry bed and set up their tents on the rock slab everyone had always dreamed of camping on. He said they saved Kat and me a spot near the back. A deep sense of unease washed over me as I read those texts. I didn't know much about water flow system, but with a massive storm bearing down on us, who knew how fast those rapids would return? We could easily end up trapped. Kat felt uneasy about it too, so instead of crossing in the dark, we packed our gear and made the usual hike along the shore to our original campsite. From there, we could look across the water and see the island, along with all my friends' tents set up high on the rock slab. The storm had finally caught up to us and the rain was getting heavy. Kat and I decided to stay put on the mainland for the night. I quickly set up a tarp overhead so we could pitch our tent without getting drenched. Kat crawled into her sleeping bag. I put on my rain slicker and walked to the edge of the lake. I tried sending a few texts to Jeremy, but none of them went through. I I stared out at the island, 100 yards away, focusing on the tents. Only 2 were visible, both glowing softly from stationary lights inside. I couldn't see any movement, but it was late, so I assumed they had all gone to sleep. As I turned back toward our tent, my flashlight beam swept across the exposed rock bed in the dried-up rapids. The rocks had strange, abnormally curved shapes. I didn't think much of it at the time, and I climbed into the tent to sleep. When Kat and I woke up the next morning, it was past 10 a.m. But the sky was pitch black. The storm was growing violently heavier. We put on our rain gear and went down to the water's edge. The rain had caused the lake level to rise. It was only a few inches higher, but the current was already starting to move fast. Across the water, the visible tents on the cliff looked identical to the night before. The lights were still on, sitting in the exact same positions. No movement. We figured our idiot friends were probably hungover and completely unaware of the storm. I shouted across the water, but the thunder instantly swallowed my voice. Knowing time was running out, Kat and I decided to trek across the exposed floor of the lake while we still could. We climbed down to the lake bed, 5 feet below the bank, and began picking our way through the mud and slick terrain. As we drew closer to the island, I began paying closer attention to those strangely shaped rocks. There were far more than I had noticed the night before. Rows of sharp, jagged rocks jutted out of the mud, surrounding the entire island. Huge, pointed boulders featured multiple curved, blade-like edges. None of them looked naturally eroded by time. They looked sharpened, like massive stone fish hooks. And as I looked closer, I saw strange inscriptions carved directly into the hooked surfaces. The carvings were ancient and deteriorating, but they were unmistakably symbols. Someone, a long time ago, had manufactured these sharp stone hooks. We pressed on, narrowly avoiding the blades and slick mud, until we found a narrow break in the rocks along the island's edge. We scrambled up the bank and entered the dense, dark woods. The storm raged above us, making the climb difficult, but we eventually stumbled upon the main campsite on the rock slab. We found 4 tents, a waterlogged fire pit, scattered beer bottles, cigarette butts, and empty camp chairs. But there were no people. We unzipped every tent. Everyone's gear, sleeping bags, and personal belongings were right where they left them. My friends were completely gone. Kat suggested they might have wandered into the woods to find a cabin or shelter from the storm. But then I looked down at the ground. The massive slab of stone we were standing on had lines of the exact same symbols carved into it as the hooked rocks in the lake bed. Nearby, we spotted a rough trail leading into the interior of the island, marked by trampled grass, snapped branches, and a trail of discarded beer cans. We followed it into the trees. The dense canopy completely blocked out what little light remained in the sky, plunging us into virtual night. The crashing sound of the storm faded, replaced by the eerie, low groaning of swaying trees. Suddenly, the trail of trash came to a dead end. The path vanished. Just as we were about to turn back, we heard it. A whimper. It was an animalistic, pained sound, whistling upward at the end of every whine. I crept forward into the dark, with Kat following right behind me. On the ground ahead lay a long nylon rope. I followed it toward the source of the whimpering. It wasn't a rope. It was a leash. At the end of it was Jeremy's pit bull, Oscar, trembling beneath the roots of an upturned tree. He was covered in small, bloody slashes. We approached him gently and pulled him out. Inspecting his wounds, it was undeniable. He had been violently attacked by something with claws. Kat and I whispered frantically, agreeing to take Oscar and get off this island immediately. Then, fresh sounds echoed through the trees ahead of us. It sounded like someone was forcibly snapping thick tree branches in half. Oscar began to whimper again, pulling hard against his leash. Kat backed away with the dog, gesturing for us to retreat to the opposite shore. But I had to know what was making that sound. I motioned for her to hold back, and I crept toward the clearing ahead. Peering through the dense foliage, I saw a terrifying sight. The leaves and grass in the small clearing were stained dark red. In the center, a large hole had been dug into the side of an earth mound. Clothes were scattered everywhere, soaked in blood. Then, I saw the bodies. I recognized Jeremy first, only because of the neon hunting jacket he always wore. His body, like the others, had been viciously ripped open, and right beside him was the source of the snapping sounds. My friend Tim was torn completely in two. Crouched between the severed halves of his torso was a tall, horrifyingly thin creature. It had leathery skin the color of damp earth, with patches of coarse black hair sprouting from its body. It possessed terrifying strength. I watched in absolute horror as it dug its claws into Tim's thigh, tore out his femur, and brought the bone to its mouth. I scanned the other bodies and realized the sickening truth. They were all missing their bones. The creature wasn't eating their meat or muscle. It was stripping them down to extract their skeleton. I watched its jaw grind down on Tim's femur. The sound was unbearable. The wet, crushing and pulverizing of solid bone. The bone snapped, and the creature swallowed the pieces whole. Suddenly, another whimper echoed from behind me. Oscar! The creature's head jerked instantly in my direction. I ducked behind a tree before it could spot me. But I knew I had seconds before it converged on my position. I turned and sprinted back through the woods, desperately trying to follow Kat's trail. But leaves and twigs snapped loudly under my boots. A deafening, inhuman screech roared through the forest. I ran faster. I could hear heavy, rapid impacts behind me as the creature closed the distance with terrifying speed. Breaking through the tree line, I was hit by the roaring wind and rain of the storm. The rapids had returned, the rushing water reaching waist height. On the far bank, Kat and Oscar were already across, screaming for me to hurry. I plunged into the violent water. The heavy current slammed into me as I scrambled across the slippery rocks, the sharp, carved edges slicing my hands. I glanced back. The tall, thin beast had plunged into the rapids right behind me, moving through the water with terrifying speed. It was only feet away. Its long, splintered claws lashed out, barely missing my shoulder. I was still 20 yards from the shore, and I knew its next strike would kill me. In a split-second act of desperation, I let my legs go completely limp. The raging current instantly swept me off my feet, shooting me 30 yards downriver. But the speed forced me directly into one of the massive submerged boulders. A row of sharp, carved stone hooks dug deep into my bicep and shoulder, pinning me violently against the rock. The pain was agonizing, but as I looked back through the rushing water, I saw the creature had attempted the exact same move, except the rapids had swept it directly into a massive, upward-pointing stone hook. The jagged blade of the hook had impaled the creature creature straight through its abdomen. It was thrashing violently, trying to pull itself free. But the barbed tip held it fast. The relentless current kept pounding against its chest, driving it deeper onto the hilt of the stone blade. Realizing I was in danger of bleeding out, I fought through the agony, tearing my flesh free from the hook pinning my arm. I dragged myself out of the raging water and collapsed onto the shore beside Kat and Oscar. We looked back one last time. The water was rising fast, submerging the creature from the chest up. It gave one final desperate thrash against the stone hook, but it was hopelessly trapped. We didn't stick around to watch it drown. Kat helped me limp through the woods until we found a nearby cottage. We called the police, triggering a massive search and rescue operation. But in the end, the official report released to the public claimed it was nothing more than a tragic, wild animal attack. I still think about those carved, hooked rocks surrounding the island. Growing up, I always thought fish hooks were meant to catch things from the outside. But looking back at those ancient symbols, I realized the truth. Those hooks weren't designed to keep people out. They were built by an ancient people to keep that monster from ever leaving.